To the pages of history, Thomas Wyatt is the most audacious rebel of the Tudor dynasty, the man who nearly stopped the wedding of Bloody Mary. But on that fateful morning at Ludgate, he was just an exhausted man, slumped on a wooden bench outside the Bell Savage Inn, staring blankly as the city gates slammed shut right in his face. There was no warm welcome from the public, as he had fantasized, only the cold silence of the very people he intended to save. He had bet everything on the people's support, only to realize they would rather lock their doors and watch him die than step out to suffer with him. Queen Mary didn't just want him dead, she processed him like a butcher handling a slab of excess meat. With absolutely no dignity, his body was treated as a propaganda tool, his head spiked, his limbs chopped into quarters, and hung scattered across the city gates like displayed merchandise. It was not a romantic martyrdom. It was a brutal and thorough erasure process, clearing away every obstacle to welcome the Spanish groom into the dynasty. Mid-16th century England was a nation in nervous breakdown, destabilized by the vacuum left by Henry VIII and the death of the boy king, Edward VI. The crown passed to Mary I, a woman carved from the grief of her mother, Catherine of Aragon, and years of living in fear. Mary's rule brought a restoration of Catholicism, fueled by her accumulated trauma and a desperate need for validity. She found that validity by marrying Prince Philip of Spain, a move that terrified the xenophobic English nobility who viewed Spain's power as a mortal threat. To them, the marriage felt less like a wedding and more like a surrender to the Inquisition, creating a suffocating atmosphere of fear. It was in this tension that Sir Thomas Wyatt the Younger found his moment, rising from a history of personal inadequacy. Wyatt the Younger lived entirely in the shadow of his father, Sir Thomas Wyatt the Elder, a diplomatic genius and poet rumored to have been Anne Boleyn's lover. The elder Wyatt was a legend who introduced the sonnet and survived Henry VIII's lethal court with brilliance. Before becoming a revolutionary, the younger Wyatt was simply the disappointing son, struggling to navigate the fortress of his father's legacy. Thomas the Younger was born with the Wyatt name, the Brooke blood. His mother, Elizabeth Brooke, was descended from kings and the expectation of greatness. But where the father was ink and subtlety, the son was iron and impulse. The young Thomas did not fit the mold of the Renaissance courtier. He found poetry tedious and diplomacy stifling. He was a creature of action, a man whose blood ran too hot for the cool corridors of power. Growing up at Allington, living under the portrait of his famous father, Thomas developed a complex. He was the lesser Wyatt, the duller blade. While the court praised his father's wit, they looked at the son and saw only a rough-hewn block of stone. Following his father's death in 1542, Thomas inherited the castle, the titles, and a mountain of debt. The elder Wyatt had lived well beyond his means, and the younger Thomas found himself land-rich but cash-poor. The stress of the estate, combined with the sudden release of parental control, sent him into a spiral. He found a kindred spirit in Henry Howard, the Earl of Surrey. Surrey was everything Wyatt was not, exquisitely arrogant, the premier nobleman of England, and convinced of his own untouchability. Together they formed a toxic, raucous duo that terrorized the streets of London. In the spring of 1543, an incident occurred that would stain Wyatt's reputation for a decade. It was a night of heavy drinking, but it wasn't a standard tavern brawl. Wyatt and Surrey, accompanied by a gang of servants and sycophants, took to the cobblestone streets of the city of London. They were armed not just with swords, but with stone bows, heavy crossbows designed to fire rocks or lead pellets. This was not a prank, it was a rampage. They moved through the sleeping city like a storm. They fired into the windows of merchant houses. They shattered the glass of prominent citizens. They broke down doors. The crashing of glass and the shouts of the drunken aristocrats echoed through the narrow alleys. It was a display of sheer, unadulterated entitlement. They were the masters of the universe, and the citizens of London were merely scenery to be smashed. The authorities, however, were unamused. The city of London was the economic engine of the realm, and its merchants were powerful. Wyatt and Surrey were arrested and hauled before the Privy Council, the terrifying inner circle of the king's government. The interrogation records offer a glimpse into Wyatt's young mind. When asked to explain their behavior, they did not plead drunkenness. They did not beg for forgiveness. In a display of breathtaking arrogance, they claimed a moral high ground. They told the council that they had gone out to awaken the citizens of London from their sins. They claimed that by breaking windows, they were reminding the people of the suddenness of God's judgment. The council didn't buy it. Surrey, a peer of the realm, was treated with kid gloves, but Wyatt was thrown into the Tower of London. For a month, the future rebel sat in the damp stone silence of the tower. It was a humiliating check on his ego. He was not the great hero. He was a vandal. He was a window smasher. He was 21 years old, broke, imprisoned, and the laughingstock of the court. The ghost of his father seemed to mock him. However, there was a darker current running beneath Wyatt's frivolity, a current that would eventually pull him toward his doom. It stemmed from a journey he had taken years earlier. As a teenager, Thomas had accompanied his father on a diplomatic mission to Spain. The sights and sounds of the Spanish court left an indelible mark on the young Englishman. Spain in the 16th century was the vanguard of Catholic orthodoxy. It was a land of extreme piety and extreme violence. It is widely believed that during his travels, the young Wyatt may have witnessed the machinery of the Spanish Inquisition firsthand. Imagine the scene: a dusty square in Valladolid or Madrid, the heat of the sun beating down, the smell of incense mixing with the smell of unwashed bodies, the procession of the auto da fe, the act of faith, the figures in their conical hats, the San Benitos, the chanting of the friars, and then the fires. For an English boy, raised in the relatively pragmatic and constantly shifting religious landscape of Henry VIII's England, the sight of men and women being burned alive for heresy by a foreign power was traumatizing. Historians argue that this moment was the genesis of Wyatt's Hispanophobia. He didn't just dislike the Spanish, he feared them in a primal, visceral way. He saw the Spanish Empire not as a civilized neighbor, but as a fanatical beast that consumed everything in its path. He saw the rigid control, the lack of liberty, the absolute submission to the church and the crown. When he sat in the Tower of London in 1543 staring at the walls, perhaps those memories returned to him. He was a prisoner of his own king, yes, but at least he was an Englishman. In Spain, he believed he would have been ash. Prison changed him. Or perhaps the realization of his debts changed him. Upon his release, Wyatt realized he could not continue as a hooligan. He needed money, and he needed respect. He found both in the only industry that was booming: war. Between 1543 and 1550, the boy died, and the soldier was born. Wyatt volunteered for the King's Wars in France. This was not the chivalric jousting of Arthurian legend. This was the grim industrial slaughter of the Gunpowder Age. Wyatt threw himself into the siege of Boulogne in 1544. Siege warfare was a brutal teacher. It was a science of geometry and patience. It was digging trenches, sapping toward enemy walls while musket balls whizzed overhead. It was calculating the trajectory of cannonballs. It was living in mud that reached the knees, surrounded by dysentery and gangrene. Wyatt thrived. To the surprise of everyone who had known him as the window smasher, Thomas Wyatt the Younger possessed a brilliant military mind. He had an aptitude for logistics and artillery. He understood the ordnance, the heavy guns. He learned how to move cannon through swamps, how to breach a wall, and how to lead men who were cold, hungry, and terrified. He rose rapidly through the ranks. He was commended for his bravery, but more importantly for his competence. By the time the war settled, he was no longer Wyatt the poet's disappointed son. He was Sir Thomas Wyatt, a battle-hardened veteran. He returned to England in 1550 a transformed man. He settled back into Allington Castle, determined to live the life of a country gentleman. He served as Sheriff of Kent. He sat as a member of Parliament. He married Jane Haught and began a family that would eventually include 10 children. Superficially, he was a pillar of the establishment. He was the kind of man the system relies on, a landowner, a magistrate, a father. But beneath the velvet doublet of the sheriff beat the heart of the soldier who had seen the Spanish fires. He was watching the horizon. When Edward VI died in the summer of 1553, the structure of England cracked. There was an attempt to place Lady Jane Grey, the 9 Days Queen, on the throne to preserve the Protestant succession. Wyatt, interestingly, did not support Jane. He was a legitimist. He believed that the law was the law, and the law said Mary Tudor was the rightful queen. In the market square of Maidstone, Wyatt stood before the people and proclaimed Mary I as Queen of England. He threw his cap in the air, he cheered, he wrote to the new queen pledging his loyalty. He believed that Mary, being a Tudor, would put England first. He believed she would rule as her father's daughter. Then came the rumors, first whispers in the dark corners of the court, then letters from friends in London. Finally, the official announcement. Mary would marry Philip. For Wyatt, the nightmare he had witnessed as a teenager was coming to Kent. He looked at the map and realized the geography of the doom facing England. If Philip became king, England would become a stepping stone for Spanish ambitions in the Netherlands. English gold would fund Spanish wars, and inevitably, the Inquisition would follow the marriage bed. Wyatt sat in Allington Castle surrounded by his children. He looked at the debts he still owed. He looked at the country he had fought for in the mud of Boulogne. He realized that the window smasher and the soldier were about to merge into something new. He began to send letters, not to the queen, but to men who owned swords. The winter was coming, and Thomas Wyatt was about to strike a match. But a single match is easily extinguished in the gales of Tudor politics. To burn down a dynasty, Wyatt knew he needed a firestorm. The solitary determination of a Kentish gentleman was not enough to counter the might of the Spanish Empire. He needed allies. He needed a strategy. And above all, he needed to transform his personal dread into a national panic. As the year turned from 1553 to 1554, the soldier stepped back to make room for the conspirator, weaving a web of alliances that stretched from the rugged coasts of Devon to the shadowed taverns of London. The plan he helped forge would be a masterpiece of ambition, but like all great tragedies, it relied on the silence of men who were all too prone to whisper. By November 1553, the fog over London had turned into a suffocating blanket of paranoia. The rumors were no longer rumors. They were policy. Queen Mary I was to marry Philip of Spain. To the modern ear, a royal marriage sounds like a harmless pageant, a day of flags, feasts, and public holidays. But to the English gentry of the mid-16th century, the announcement landed like a declaration of war. They understood the geopolitics of Europe better than Mary gave them credit for. They looked across the channel and saw the Habsburg jaws closing. The Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, Philip's father, already controlled Spain, the Netherlands, parts of Italy, and the vast wealth of the New World. If England were added to that portfolio, it would cease to be a sovereign kingdom. It would become a depot for Spanish ships and a bank for Spanish debts. Sir Thomas Wyatt sat in the drafty hall of Allington Castle, staring at the embers of a fire that refused to warm the room. He was 32 years old, a father, a husband, and a soldier. He had spent the last few months trying to be a loyal subject. But loyalty to the Queen was colliding violently with loyalty to the country. He was not alone in his dread. Across England, a network of disaffected gentlemen was beginning to tighten. These were not the religious fanatics of the past. They were the military and political elite. They were men who had served Henry VIII. They were men who owned land, commanded local militias, and remembered a time when England answered to no one but God and the King. The center of the resistance was not a battlefield, but a series of smoke-filled rooms in London taverns and townhouses. Here, the four-pronged plot was born. It was on parchment a masterpiece of strategic planning. It was designed to overwhelm the government by stretching its resources to the breaking point. The conspirators knew that Mary had no standing army. She relied on the trained bands, local militias loyal to the nobility, and her own household guards. If the rebellion struck from all sides simultaneously, the Queen would have nowhere to turn. The plan was a coordinated strike from the four corners of the realm, scheduled for Palm Sunday, March 18, 1554. In the west, Sir Peter Carew would raise Devon and Cornwall. In the Midlands, the Duke of Suffolk, the father of the tragic Lady Jane Grey, would raise Leicestershire. In the borderlands, Sir James Croft would raise the warlike counties on the Welsh border. And in the southeast, Sir Thomas Wyatt would raise Kent, the Garden of England, and the gateway to London. The objective was carefully calibrated. Publicly, they would not call for the Queen's removal. That was treason, and treason frightened the common people. Instead, they would claim they were rising to protect the Queen from evil counselors and to prevent the Spanish marriage. But privately, the endgame was darker. If Mary refused to back down, she would be deposed. In her place, they would put her half-sister, the Princess Elizabeth, and to secure the line, Elizabeth would be married to an English nobleman, keeping the bloodline pure and the Spanish out. They had the soldiers. They had the weapons. They had the public support. What they lacked was the ability to keep a secret. Every conspiracy has a flaw. In the plot of 1554, the flaw had a name, Edward Courtenay. Courtenay was the Earl of Devon and the last direct descendant of the Plantagenet kings. He carried the blood of the White Rose, the House of York, which they hoped to graft onto the Tudor stem. But Edward Courtenay was a broken vessel. He had spent his entire youth, from age 12 to 26, locked in the Tower of London, simply because his blood was too royal for Henry VIII's comfort. Mary had released him when she took the throne, but the damage was done. He was socially stunted, emotionally volatile, and desperate for approval. The conspirators needed a figurehead, and they picked Courtenay. It was a fatal miscalculation. They whispered their plans to him, feeding his ego, promising him a crown and a queen. But Courtenay wasn't built for high treason. He was built for survival. As the weeks ticked by toward March, the government began to sniff out the plot. The Lord Chancellor, Stephen Gardiner, a wily, fox-like bishop who served as Mary's right hand, sensed the tension. He turned his gaze on the weakest link. Gardiner summoned Courtenay. He didn't need a rack or thumbscrews. He simply used pressure. He questioned the young earl about his associations, his late-night meetings, his whisperings with Wyatt and Carew. Courtenay, terrified of going back to the tower, cracked like thin ice. He spilled everything. He named names. He detailed the four prongs. He gave up the dates. The reaction from the crown was swift and devastating. In January 1554, 2 months before the planned uprising, the trap snapped shut. The government moved to arrest the leaders. The plan was a masterpiece on paper, 4 armies striking from 4 corners of England simultaneously. But a conspiracy is only as strong as its weakest man. One by one, Wyatt's allies crumbled. In the west, they fled before drawing a sword. In the Midlands, they were hunted down in hollow trees. In London, they spilled the secrets under the mere threat of torture. In the span of a single week, the grand conspiracy evaporated. 3 of the 4 armies vanished. Only one man was left standing. Only one man refused to run. Thomas Wyatt looked at the map, saw he was alone, and decided to march anyway, but they forgot about Kent. News of the betrayal reached Allington Castle on a gray morning in late January. Sir Thomas Wyatt was in his study when a breathless messenger arrived, his boots caked in mud. The message was clear. Courtenay has talked. The council knows. They are coming for you. Wyatt stood at the crossroads of his life. He had 2 choices. Choice A was the Peter Carew route. Run. He could ride for the coast, Kent was full of ports, hire a fishing boat, and be in France by morning. He would live in exile, losing his lands, but keeping his head. Choice B was madness. It was to proceed alone, to launch the rebellion 2 months early, in the dead of winter, without the support of the West, the Midlands, or Wales, to march on London with whatever men he could scrape together in 24 hours. Wyatt looked out the window at the Medway. He thought of the Spanish ships. He thought of his father's poetry about the fleeting nature of life. And perhaps the old soldier in him simply refused to retreat. He turned to the messenger. "We do not run," he said, "we ride." He ordered the castle bells to be rung. He sent riders to his friends, the fiercely loyal gentry of Kent, the Culpepers, the Isleys, the Knivets. He told them the time was now. On Thursday, January 25th, 1554, Thomas Wyatt rode into the market square of Maidstone. It was market day, and the town was bustling with farmers, merchants, and tradesmen. Wyatt mounted the stone steps of the market cross. He was dressed not in court finery, but in full armor, a sword at his hip. The chatter of the crowd died down. They knew him. He was their neighbor, their sheriff, the man who had fixed their bridges and settled their disputes. Wyatt drew a breath and began the performance of his life. He knew exactly which buttons to push. He did not speak of the complex succession laws. He did not speak of Protestantism versus Catholicism. He spoke to their fear. "Englishmen," he bellowed, his voice cutting through the cold air, "we are in great peril." He pulled out a letter, likely a fake, and waved it in the air. He claimed it was evidence that the Spanish were already on their way. "Do you wish to be slaves?" he asked them. "Do you wish to see your wives and daughters violated by Spanish soldiers? Do you wish to see your lands seized by foreigners? For I tell you, Philip of Spain comes not as a husband, but as a conqueror." He painted a graphic, terrifying picture of England under the Spanish heel. He told them that if they did not fight now, they would be worse than the beasts of the field. The reaction was electric. The xenophobia of the English, nurtured by centuries of island isolation, ignited. A roar went up from the crowd. "A Wyatt! A Wyatt!" they shouted. Men threw down their pitchforks and ran to fetch their bows. In that moment, Wyatt transformed from a conspirator into a warlord. The speed of the mobilization was terrifying. Within 24 hours, Wyatt had 1,500 men gathered at Rochester. These were not ragtag peasants. These were the yeomen of Kent, men who were legally required to practice archery every Sunday. They were tough, independent, and heavily armed. Wyatt, using his experience as the master of ordnance, seized a squadron of the Queen's ships that were anchored in the Medway. He stripped them of their cannons and ammunition. Suddenly the rebel army had artillery. Wyatt set up his headquarters at Rochester Castle, an ancient fortress commanding the bridge over the Medway. He established a military discipline that shocked observers. There was no looting. There was no drunkenness. He paid his men with his own silver. He issued a proclamation that anyone caught stealing from the locals would be hanged. He was trying to show the country that this was not a riot. It was a legitimate military action by honorable men. Back in London, the mood shifted from relief to panic. The Queen's Council realized that while the other limbs of the plot had been severed, the right arm, the one holding the sword, was swinging for their necks. Queen Mary, realizing her household guards were insufficient, turned to the oldest and most decorated soldier in the kingdom, Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk. He was 80 years old, a relic of her father's wars, but he was a legend. She ordered him to take the Whitecoats, the elite City of London militia, march to Rochester, and crush the upstart Wyatt. Norfolk rode out with contempt. He viewed Wyatt as a naughty boy who needed a thrashing. He had no idea that he was marching his men toward the most spectacular mutiny in English history. As the two armies converged on the frozen mud of Rochester Bridge, the stage was set for the impossible. The window smasher was about to break the crown. The last day of January 1554 brought a biting wind that whipped off the Thames, freezing the mud in the roads and turning breath into steam. In London, the Duke of Norfolk, Thomas Howard, was preparing for what he believed would be a short, sharp police action. Norfolk was 80 years old. He was a man of a different era, a relic who had ridden with Henry VIII. He had crushed the Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536. He had fought the Scots. He had survived the axe by a miracle of timing. To him, Thomas Wyatt was an irritant, a buzzing fly to be swatted. Norfolk rode out of London at the head of a formidable force. His vanguard consisted of his own personal retinue and artillery, but the bulk of his army was the Whitecoats. These were the trained bands of the City of London, citizen soldiers named for their distinctive white jerkins, often embroidered with the Red Cross of St. George. They were well equipped, disciplined, and numbered over 500. As they marched down the Dover Road toward Rochester, the mood was light. The officers joked about being back in London in time for supper. They were marching to put down a traitor who had dared to disturb the Queen's peace. They had the cannons, they had the numbers, they had the legitimacy of the crown. But as they neared the Medway, the air grew heavy. They weren't marching into a riot, they were marching into a fortress. Wyatt had chosen his ground with the eye of an engineer. He had fortified the eastern end of the Rochester Bridge, a stone span crossing the turbulent river. He had dismantled part of the bridge to prevent a cavalry charge and positioned his stolen naval guns to sweep the approach. On the morning of the battle, Wyatt rode among his men. He knew the odds. If the Whitecoats attacked with determination, his force of Kentish yeomen would eventually break. He needed a miracle. He needed to win the battle before the first shot was fired. Norfolk arrived and surveyed the rebel positions. He ordered his herald to step forward and offer a pardon to any man who laid down his arms. "The Queen is merciful," the herald shouted across the freezing water. Wyatt stepped forward, fully armored. "We need no pardon," he shouted back, his voice carrying over the wind, "for we have done no wrong." Norfolk, losing patience, signaled for the assault. The artillery was primed. The Whitecoats lowered their pikes and began the slow, rhythmic march toward the bridge. The drums beat the cadence of death. Rat-tat-tat, rat-tat-tat. Wyatt's men tensed, fingers tightening on bowstrings. This was it, Englishmen against Englishmen. And then the drumbeat stopped. At the front of the Whitecoats marched a man named Alexander Brett, a captain of the London militia. Just as the order to charge was about to be given, Brett drew his sword. But he didn't point it at Wyatt. He turned and faced his own men. "Masters," Brett roared, halting the advance, "we go to fight against our native countrymen, our neighbors, and our friends." The silence that followed was louder than any cannon blast. Norfolk sat on his horse, stunned, his mouth agape. Brett continued, his voice rising with passion. "They act to preserve us from the dominion of these proud Spaniards. Do you wish to be slaves? I tell you, as for me, I will not fight them." He ripped off his white coat. "I am an Englishman." The dam broke. 500 men erupted in a cheer that shook the birds from the trees. "A Wyatt! A Wyatt!" they screamed. They turned their pikes around. They threw their hats in the air. The ranks of the Queen's army dissolved into a riot of embrace and celebration. The Duke of Norfolk watched in horror as his army defected en masse. He was an old wolf who had suddenly realized the pack was no longer his. Realizing that he was now the target, the 80-year-old Duke spurred his horse and fled for his life, galloping back toward London with his tail between his legs. He left behind everything: 8 brass cannons, all his ammunition, and the prestige of the crown. Wyatt walked across the bridge, arms open to embrace Alexander Brett. His army had not only survived, it had doubled. He now had the city of London's own soldiers on his side. The road to the capital was wide open. When the mud-spattered Duke of Norfolk stumbled back into London with the news of the disaster, the city descended into hysteria. This was Black Monday. The shops closed. The gates of the city were slammed shut and barred. Women wept in the streets, convinced that Wyatt's wild men of Kent were coming to sack the city. Rumors flew that Wyatt was already at the gates, that he had 20,000 men, that he was going to burn the tower. The Privy Council was in meltdown. They begged Queen Mary to flee. "Go to Windsor," they urged. "Go to France. You must leave London." But they had underestimated Mary Tudor. Mary was small, nearsighted, and frequently ill. She had none of the physical imposingness of her father, but she had his spine. She knew that if she fled London now, she would never return. A monarch who runs is a monarch who falls. She looked at her terrified councillors with cold, hard eyes. "I will not leave," she said. "I will go to the people." On February 1st, while Wyatt was marching through Deptford, Queen Mary rode to the Guildhall, the heart of the city's commerce and government. She summoned the Lord Mayor and the aldermen. She stood on a dais, a lone woman in a sea of anxious men in velvet robes. This was the most dangerous moment of her life. These men controlled the money and the militia. If they opened the gates to Wyatt, she was dead. She began to speak. Her voice was surprisingly deep and resonant, possessing a gravity that silenced the crowded hall. She did not plead. She commanded. "I am come unto you in mine own person," she began, "to tell you that which you already see and know, the traitor Wyatt." She dismantled Wyatt's arguments. She addressed the Spanish marriage directly. "I am not so bent to my will," she declared, "that for my own pleasure I would choose where you should be cursed. For I am already married to this realm, and the laws of the same. You are my children and my kin. I cannot believe that you will surrender me to a traitor." She threw the challenge down. She asked for their loyalty not as a favor, but as a duty. She swore that she would die in the city before she abandoned them. It was a master stroke. The merchants of London, who feared instability above all else, were swayed. They saw a queen who was brave, articulate, and lawful. They threw their caps in the air. "God save Queen Mary," they shouted. When Mary rode back to the palace, the mood had shifted. The city was no longer a panicked victim. It was a fortress loyal to the crown. On Saturday, February 3rd, Thomas Wyatt reached Southwark, the borough on the south bank of the Thames. The view that greeted him was breathtaking and heartbreaking. Across the gray expanse of the river lay the city of London. He could see the spires of the churches, the bulk of St. Paul's Cathedral, and the Tower of London looming in the east. Victory was right there, just a few hundred yards away. But the drawbridge in the middle of London Bridge had been raised. The gates on the far side were shut. And looking across the water, Wyatt saw something that made his blood run cold. The walls of the tower and the bridge gatehouse were bristling with cannon. He set up his camp in Southwark. The residents were terrified. They knew that if Wyatt stayed, the Queen's guns would open fire. A delegation of Southwark women approached Wyatt. They fell to their knees in the mud. "Sir," they wept, "we beg you. If you fire on the city, they will fire back. Our houses are made of timber and thatch. We will be burned in our beds. Please have mercy on us." Wyatt was a soldier, but he was not a butcher. He looked at the weeping women. He looked at the cannon trained on the homes of the innocent. He knew that if he engaged in an artillery duel, he would destroy the very people he claimed to be saving. "I will not buy my victory with your ashes," he told them. He ordered his men to hold their fire. For 3 days he waited, hoping the city would rise up and lower the bridge for him. He hoped the Guildhall speech was just bluster. He hoped his friends inside the walls would act, but the gates remained shut. The loyalty of London held. On February 6th, Wyatt realized the game had changed. He could not cross London Bridge. He could not swim the Thames with heavy artillery. He called a council of war in a tavern in Southwark. The room was thick with smoke and desperation. His captains were arguing. "We must attack," one shouted. "We must retreat to Kent," shouted another. Wyatt slammed his hand on the table. "We do neither." He unrolled a map. "If we cannot cross here, we cross where the river narrows." He pointed a finger to the west, to the town of Kingston upon Thames, 10 miles upstream. "We march to Kingston," Wyatt declared. "We repair the bridge there, we cross the river, and we march back to London from the west. We will come at them from the side they do not expect." It was a bold plan. It was also a desperate one. It meant a forced march of over 20 miles, at night, in a winter storm, with heavy cannon. It meant leaving their supply lines. It meant gambling everything on one last throw of the dice. Wyatt stood up and put on his helmet. Outside, the sky was turning black. A storm was rolling in. "Sound the drums," he whispered. "We march into the dark." Tuesday, February 6th, 1554. The sun had set, but there was no darkness, only a gray, freezing twilight of sleet and rain. Thomas Wyatt rode at the head of his army, his face set in a grim mask. They were leaving the safety of Southwark, turning their backs on the impregnable London Bridge, and marching west into the storm. The destination was Kingston upon Thames, a market town 10 miles upstream. It was the nearest crossing point. The plan was simple but grueling. March all night, cross the river before dawn, and strike London from the undefended west before the Queen could reposition her troops. It was a hell march in the truest sense. The roads of Tudor England were bad in summer. In February they were liquid bogs. The clay soil of the Thames Valley grabbed at boots and hooves like clutching hands. The men, who had been on high alert for weeks, were exhausted. They hadn't slept properly in days. They marched in a trance, heads down against the driving sleet, their armor heavy and freezing against their skin. Every mile men slipped away. They vanished into the hedgerows, deciding that the warmth of a barn was better than the cold promise of treason. Wyatt ignored the desertions. He kept his eyes on the road. He was racing the sun. They reached Kingston around 4 a.m. The town was dark, but the river was a roaring black obstacle. Wyatt rode to the bridge and cursed. The Royalists had been there first. They had torn up the middle planks of the wooden bridge, leaving gaping holes over the rushing water. It was impassable. For a lesser commander, this would have been the end. But Wyatt was an engineer. He didn't sleep. He didn't rest. He ordered his men to tear down the walls of a nearby warehouse. They used the timber to bridge the gaps, lashing planks together with ropes and determination. Wyatt worked alongside his men, hammering and hauling. By dawn, the bridge was rickety, terrifying, but functional. The army, now reduced to about 3,000 men, began to cross. The artillery rumbled over the makeshift planks, the wood groaning under the weight of the bronze guns. They were across. They were on the north bank. They were on the same side of the river as the Queen. Wednesday, February 7th. The morning broke gray and miserable. The army turned the east, marching back toward London. They passed through Brentford and Turnham Green. The pace was frantic. Wyatt knew that if he reached London by noon, he might still catch the Queen's forces off guard. And then, disaster struck. It happened near Turnham Green. The carriage of the great gun, a massive piece of bronze artillery that was the pride of Wyatt's arsenal, hit a deep rut in the road. There was a sickening crack. The heavy wooden wheel shattered. The gun lurched and collapsed into the mud, an immovable anchor of iron and wood. The column ground to a halt. Wyatt's captains galloped up to him. "Sir," they shouted, "leave it! We must move! Every minute is worth a life!" This was the pivotal moment of the rebellion. A ruthless tactician would have spiked the gun and marched on. Speed was their only weapon left. But Wyatt was the master of ordnance. He loved his guns. He saw them not just as tools, but as the key to breaching the city walls. He could not bear to abandon his most powerful weapon. "We fix it," Wyatt ordered. His advisors looked at him in horror. "It will take hours, sir." "We fix it," he roared. For 3 agonizing hours, the rebel army sat in the rain while blacksmiths and carpenters struggled to repair the wheel. The momentum evaporated. The adrenaline faded, replaced by the shivering cold of reality. While Wyatt cursed the mud and the broken wood, inside St. James's Palace, Queen Mary was awake. She wasn't fleeing. She wasn't packing her jewels. She was praying. Surrounded by panicked courtiers urging her to run, the tiny, nearsighted woman remained essentially immovable. While Wyatt fought the mechanics of a cannon, Mary was fortifying her soul. It was a battle between a man relying on iron and a woman relying on God. And on this day, God seemed to be favoring the Queen. Because of this fatal delay, the news of his crossing reached London. The Queen's generals, the Earl of Pembroke and the Earl of Clinton, had time to wake up, eat breakfast, put on their armor, and deploy their troops. The surprise was gone. Wyatt had traded a kingdom for a cannon. By the time the army resumed the march, it was late afternoon. They reached the area of Knightsbridge and Hyde Park. The terrain here was open fields, perfect for cavalry. The Queen's army was waiting. The Earl of Pembroke had thousands of men drawn up on the hill where St. James's Palace now stands. As Wyatt's ragged column appeared, the royal artillery opened fire. It wasn't a battle so much as a brawl. Wyatt, realizing he was being flanked, made a snap decision. He didn't stop to fight Pembroke's main force. He ordered his men to run. "To the city," he shouted. "To the city! The gates will be open." He believed that if he could just get to the city walls to Ludgate, the citizens would let him in, and Pembroke's army would be locked out. The rebel column split in two like a worm cut by a spade. The rear guard was cut off and slaughtered by Pembroke's cavalry. But the vanguard, Wyatt and his hardest corps of about 500 men, broke through. They ran down what is now Pall Mall, past Charing Cross and onto the Strand. It was a surreal scene. The citizens of London leaned out of their windows to watch. They didn't fight. They just watched the race as if it were a pageant. Wyatt rode furiously, his sword drawn, shouting, "God save Queen Mary," to confuse the onlookers, hoping they wouldn't block his path. He reached Fleet Street. He could see the gate ahead, Ludgate. It was one of the main entrances to the city of London. Wyatt's heart must have been hammering against his ribs. This was it, the moment of truth. If the gates opened, he had won. The city would be his fortress. The Queen would be forced to negotiate. He rode up to the heavy wooden doors. They were shut tight. He pounded on the wood with the hilt of his sword. "Open!" he screamed. "I am Wyatt, the Queen's friend. Open for the true friends of England." There was a pause. Then a small wicket gate opened near the top. The face of Lord William Howard, the Lord Admiral, appeared. He was not smiling. "Avaunt, traitor," Howard said coldly. "You shall not come in." The shutter slammed closed. The echo of those words signaled the death of the rebellion. The silence that followed was absolute. Wyatt sat on his horse, staring at the wood grain of the gate. The adrenaline that had sustained him for weeks drained away, leaving him hollow. He looked back. His army was gone. Most had been cut off at Charing Cross. The few hundred who remained were huddled in the street, panting, muddy, and terrified. They looked at him for orders, but he had no orders left. There was no plan C. Wyatt turned his horse around. He rode slowly back toward Temple Bar. The fight had gone out of him. He was not defeated by a superior strategy or a brilliant general. He was defeated by a broken wheel and a locked door. Near the Temple Bar gate, a royal herald, Sir Maurice Berkeley, rode up to him. The street was filling with the Queen's soldiers. The trap had closed. Berkeley looked at Wyatt. There was no malice in his eyes, only a strange pity. "Sir," Berkeley said, "your hap is evil. It is over. Yield yourself." Wyatt looked at his sword. It was the sword of a Wyatt, the sword of a Kentish gentleman. He had thought to use it to save England. Now it was just a piece of metal in the hand of a dead man. He didn't speak. He simply threw the sword into the mud. He climbed down from his horse. He was so exhausted, he nearly fell. He walked over to a stone bench near the gate and sat down. He put his head in his hands. "I have kept my promise," he whispered to no one. Berkeley approached him gently. He asked Wyatt to mount a horse behind him so that he would not be torn apart by the gathering crowd. Wyatt climbed up, sitting behind his captor like a child. As they rode toward the Tower of London, the people of London, the same people Wyatt had tried to save, jeered and spat. They threw mud. They shouted, "Traitor!" Wyatt stared straight ahead. He was entering the belly of the beast. The window smasher had returned to the tower, but this time there would be no release. The rebellion was over. The retribution was about to begin. The heavy wooden gates of the Tower of London had swallowed Thomas Wyatt, effectively ending the kinetic fury of the march and replacing it with the cold, damp stillness of the dungeon. Yet, while the clang of swords had ceased on the streets, the machinery of state vengeance was just beginning to grind into gear. The rebellion on the field was over, but a far more dangerous battle was about to commence within the interrogation chambers, a struggle not for territory but for the truth and for the life of the Princess Elizabeth. Outside, the carpenters were already hammering together the gallows. Inside, the crown prepared to extract the price of treason in both blood and confession. When the doors of the Tower of London slammed shut behind Sir Thomas Wyatt on February 7th, 1554, they didn't just lock away a rebel. They locked away the last remnants of Queen Mary's patience. Until this moment, Mary I had been surprisingly lenient. She had spared her enemies after taking the throne. She had wanted to be a mother to her people, but the sight of Wyatt's army marching down Fleet Street had killed that instinct. The mother was gone. The avenger had taken her place. Mary realized that as long as rival claimants to the throne existed, men like Wyatt would try to use them. Her mercy had been interpreted as weakness. Now she would show them strength. The reaction was immediate and terrifying. The Queen's advisors, led by the ruthless Bishop Gardiner and the icy Spanish ambassador Simon Renard, demanded a purge. They argued that the rebellion was a hydra. Cut off one head and another grows. They had to burn the roots. The first to pay the price was a girl who had nothing to do with Wyatt's rebellion. Lady Jane Grey, the 9 Days Queen, was already a prisoner in the Tower. She was 16 years old, brilliant, and harmless. Wyatt had never mentioned her. He had fought for Elizabeth. But to the Queen, Jane was a symbol. On February 12th, just 5 days after Wyatt's capture, Jane was led out to the green within the Tower. She was blindfolded. She fumbled for the block, crying out in a heartbreaking panic, "What shall I do? Where is it?" Her head fell. An hour later, her husband, Guilford Dudley, followed her. Then her father, the Duke of Suffolk, who had failed to raise the Midlands, was hunted down and executed. The message was clear. No one is safe. If the execution of princes was tragic, the fate of the common soldiers was horrific. Mary wanted the people of London to smell the stench of treason. She ordered martial law. On February 14th, the carpentry began. But these were not stages for pageants. They were gallows. They were erected at every gate of the city, in Cheapside, in Fleet Street, at Charing Cross, and even on the street corners of Maidstone and Rochester. It became known as the Great Hanging. Over 100 of Wyatt's men were hanged, drawn, and quartered. For weeks, Londoners could not walk to the market without passing the rotting corpse of a neighbor or friend dangling in chains. The city, usually noisy and vibrant, fell into a stunned, sullen silence. The scar mentioned in the beginning was being carved into the collective memory of the capital. While the bodies swung in the wind outside, a different kind of torture was taking place inside the stone walls of the Tower. Sir Thomas Wyatt was the prize prisoner. But the government didn't just want his life. They had plenty of reasons to take that. They wanted his voice. Ambassador Renard was obsessed with one goal: the death of Princess Elizabeth. He knew that as long as Elizabeth lived, she was a rallying point for Protestants and anti-Spanish patriots. He told Queen Mary that Prince Philip could not safely land in England until Elizabeth was removed. But they needed proof. They needed a smoking gun. They needed Wyatt to say, yes, Elizabeth knew. Yes, she approved. Yes, she is the architect. For weeks, Wyatt was subjected to intense interrogation. We do not know for certain if he was put on the rack. The records are deliberately vague, using phrases like examined strictly. But given the stakes and the era, it is almost certain he was subjected to physical and psychological torment. His interrogators, led by the Lord Chancellor, dangled two things in front of him. First, pain, the promise of a traitor's death, being disemboweled while still alive. Second, life, a whisper that if he gave them Elizabeth, the Queen might show mercy. Just one name, Thomas. Just say she sent you a letter. It was the ultimate test of character. Wyatt was a man who had broken windows, smashed cannons, and led thousands to their deaths. He was not a saint. He was desperate to save his lands for his children. But in the damp darkness of his cell, Wyatt found a line he would not cross. He admitted his own guilt freely. He admitted writing to Elizabeth, but he steadfastly refused to implicate her in the plot. She knew nothing, he repeated over and over. The treason is mine alone. In a desperate bid to break him, the council dragged Edward Courtenay, the weak link who had spilled the beans, to confront Wyatt. It was a pathetic scene. Courtenay, the terrified, weeping earl, stood before the battle-hardened Wyatt. Courtenay accused Wyatt of everything, trying to shift the blame. Wyatt looked at the young man with utter contempt. He didn't even argue. He simply denied the lies with a weary dignity. He realized that Courtenay was just a pawn, broken by fear. Wyatt, conversely, seemed to grow stronger as his death approached. He was no longer fighting for a crown, he was fighting for his soul. On March 15th, Wyatt was brought to Westminster Hall for his trial. It was a piece of theater. Everyone knew the verdict before the judges sat down. Wyatt was dressed in black. He looked thin and pale from his imprisonment, but he stood tall. When the indictment was read, accusing him of stirring war against the Queen, he did not plead for his life. "I have offended the Queen's Majesty," he told the court. "I trust only in her mercy." He was found guilty of high treason. The sentence was pronounced. He was to die the full, gruesome death of a traitor. Wyatt listened without flinching. He was taken back to the Tower to await the end. But the government wasn't done. They delayed the execution. Why? Because they still hoped he would crack. They kept Elizabeth in the Tower, just a few cells away, terrified that her turn was next. Rumors began to circulate that Wyatt had confessed. The government agents whispered to the crowds that Wyatt had implicated Elizabeth. They tried to convict her in the court of public opinion since they couldn't convict her in a court of law. Wyatt heard these rumors. He realized that even in death his name was being used to destroy the future queen. He knew he had one last battle to fight. He didn't have a sword and he didn't have an army. He only had his last words. In Tudor England, the speech from the scaffold was a sacred moment. A dying man was believed to speak the truth, as he was about to meet God. If Wyatt could speak to the crowd, he could undo all of Renard's work. On the morning of April 11th, 1554, the lieutenant of the Tower came to Wyatt's cell. "It is time," he said. Wyatt stood up. He adjusted his collar. He walked out into the cool spring air of Tower Hill, where a massive crowd was waiting. He looked at the axe, he looked at the straw, and he looked at the people. He took a deep breath. The stage was finally set on Tower Hill for the concluding act of this tragedy. All the tortures, the secret interrogations, and the political maneuverings of the past weeks had led to this single moment of public spectacle. The crowd held its breath, waiting for the abject capitulation of the traitor, while the Queen's agents waited anxiously for the confirmation of their narrative. But as Thomas Wyatt looked out over the sea of faces one last time, he carried a final weapon that no axe could sever, a determination to use his dying breath to rewrite the ending of his story and shield the future of England from the grave. Tower Hill, April 11th, 1554. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of the river and the damp earth. A massive crowd had gathered, thousands of Londoners pressing against the wooden barriers. They had come to see a traitor die, but many had also come to pay respects to a man they secretly admired. Wyatt was not a reviled villain like the politician Northumberland. He was a soldier, a patriot, and to many, a tragic hero who had tried to save them from Spain. Wyatt climbed the wooden steps of the scaffold. He was 33 years old. His hands were unbound, but his face was gaunt. The weeks of interrogation had taken their toll, yet his eyes were clear. On the scaffold stood the executioner, the Sheriff of London, and the grim apparatus of his sentence. But Wyatt wasn't looking at the axe. He was looking at the people. The government officials were nervous. They knew Wyatt was a powerful orator. They feared he would use this final platform to incite another riot, or worse, to denounce the Queen. They wanted a standard apology. "I have sinned. I deserve to die. God save Queen Mary." Wyatt knelt and prayed. Then he stood and turned to the crowd. The silence was absolute. He began with the customary contrition. He admitted his rebellion. He acknowledged that by the laws of the land, he deserved to die. But then he pivoted, and whereas it is said and whistled abroad, his voice rang out strong and steady, that I should accuse my Lady Elizabeth's grace. It is not so, good people." The sheriff flinched. This was exactly what they didn't want him to say. Wyatt continued, raising his voice so that even those at the back could hear. "For I assure you, neither they nor any other now in durance was privy to my rising or commotion before I began. And this is most true. It was a bombshell." With his dying breath, Thomas Wyatt was acting as the sole witness for the defense of Princess Elizabeth. He was publicly exonerating the future queen. The Sheriff of London, panic rising in his chest, stepped forward and interrupted him. "You have confessed it to the council," he shouted, trying to drown Wyatt out. Wyatt turned to the sheriff and looked him in the eye. "That which I said then, I said, but that which I say now is true." It was a master stroke of ambiguity and courage. He implied that anything he might have confessed in the torture chamber was a lie forced by pain. But what he was saying now, facing God, was the truth. The crowd murmured. The government's narrative was shattered. Wyatt had taken the blame entirely on his own shoulders, shielding Elizabeth with his body one last time. Wyatt turned to the executioner. He forgave the man, as was custom. He took off his gown and unbuttoned his shirt. He tied the handkerchief around his eyes himself. He knelt in the straw. He whispered a final prayer. "Lord, into thy hands I commend my spirit." The axe rose and fell. It was a clean strike. The rebellion was officially over. But the horror was not. The sentence for treason was hanged, drawn, and quartered. But because he was a nobleman, he was spared the hanging and disemboweling while alive. However, his dead body was subjected to the full ritual of state vengeance. His head was held up to the crowd. "Behold the head of a traitor!" His body was stripped and butchered into 4 quarters. These grisly trophies were boiled in cumin and salt to preserve them, then nailed up at various locations around the city as a warning to others. His head was placed on a pike at the Gallows of Tyburn, the notorious execution site near modern-day Marble Arch. Queen Mary and Ambassador Reynard breathed a sigh of relief. The head of the Hydra was gone. They believed the spirit of the rebellion would rot along with his flesh. They were wrong. Days after the execution, a strange thing happened. The pike at Tyburn stood empty. Sir Thomas Wyatt's head had vanished. It hadn't fallen off. It had been stolen. Despite the guards, despite the terror of the regime, someone had climbed the gibbet in the dead of night and taken the head of the rebel leader. The government was furious. They launched an investigation, but the head was never found. It was never returned. History tells us it was likely taken by a sympathizer, perhaps a former soldier, perhaps a servant from Allington Castle, who wanted to give Wyatt the dignity of a Christian burial, or at least to save him from being picked apart by crows. To this day, we do not know where the head of Sir Thomas Wyatt lies. He has no known grave. He vanished into the mystery of the city he tried to conquer. In the short term, Wyatt's rebellion seemed like a catastrophic failure. Mary married Philip of Spain in July 1554. The Catholic Restoration continued with a vengeance. Nearly 300 Protestants were burned at the stake over the next 4 years, earning the Queen the epithet Bloody Mary. But the failure was an illusion. Wyatt had achieved 2 monumental things. First, he saved Elizabeth. By refusing to implicate her, even under the threat of agony, he made it legally impossible for Mary to execute her sister. Elizabeth survived the reign of her sister largely because Wyatt refused to drag her down with him. Second, he poisoned the Spanish marriage. The rebellion proved to Philip that he was hated in England. Philip spent as little time as possible in the country, and he never allowed Spanish troops to garrison there. Wyatt's xenophobic warning had scared the government into caution. In 1558, Mary I died, broken and childless. The bells of London rang, not for grief, but for joy. Princess Elizabeth ascended the throne as Elizabeth I. One of the first things Queen Elizabeth did was to restore the Wyatt family. She remembered. She returned the manor of Allington to Wyatt's son, George. She passed an act of Parliament restoring the family in blood and dignity. She never forgot that her crown had been bought, in part, by the silence of the man who died on Tower Hill. Wyatt's son, George Wyatt, became a writer and a biographer of Anne Boleyn. The family flourished, producing governors and poets in the American colonies. Sir Thomas Wyatt the Younger is often a footnote in history books, overshadowed by the glamour of Henry VIII or the glory of the Armada. He is dismissed as a hothead, a failure, a traitor. But if you look closely at the tapestry of British history, you see his thread is golden and essential. He was a man who began his life breaking windows and ended it breaking the grip of an empire. He was a lad who grew into a martyr. He reminds us that history is not always written by the victors. Sometimes it is written by the losers who leave a scar so deep that the future grows around it. Wyatt was right. The Spanish marriage was a disaster, and Mary died broken just 4 years later. When Elizabeth I finally took the throne, one of her first acts was to restore the Wyatt family to their lands and titles. It was the ultimate vindication. The traitor's son became the Queen's favorite. Somewhere in the dark earth of London, the headless body of Thomas Wyatt could finally rest. He had lost the battle at Ludgate, but from the grave, he had won the war for England's soul.